Welcome to the podcast Scattered, One Person's Search for the Story Behind Human Remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. In today's interview, I talked to Brie Smith from Return Home, a U.S. company in Washington state that provides in-person laying-in services and the ability to visit your loved one through the terramation or human composting or body composting process. This was just too good to pass up, so Brie was kind enough to let me interview her for today's episode. But before we get to that, here's a few updates. As of this recording, and it is September 24th in 2023, we have completed yet another year of the scavenging study in Alberta. I collected the remains of our last 2022 pig, last year's pigs, near Edmonton in the middle of August, so last month, with the continuing help of some wonderful University of Alberta students. So very special thank you and call out to Kira, Alyssa, Megan, Brianne, and Blanca. Thank you very much for your help. It was a miserable, wet day when none of us were happy, but we got it done in record time, and that's all that matters. We got it done. So thank you very much. In regards to the scavenging study, Sherry has already analyzed her data on the scavenging guilds and has submitted a paper for publication. Once that's been accepted, I'll do my best to get an open access version available on my website for anybody who's interested. My paper, however, still needs to be written. So Sherry and her scavenging guilds, she finished collecting her data last fall, so in fall 2022. My data, however, I just finished collecting that in August. I still need to count bones and analyze bones and do an inventory and all that wonderful stuff. So I'm a little bit behind, Sherry. So all of that is now sitting on my balcony. I have dozens of boxes of bones on my balcony waiting to be inventoried. And they're outside because, well, I don't want to keep all those pig bones inside my home. So they're outside. But because I'm in Canada, I better get on that because otherwise I won't be able to sit outside and do all that counting and analyzing bones. So I'm on a time scale here. So when I get Sherry's paper and it's been accepted, open access, I will post that on a website for you in case you're interested. But you'll have to wait a little bit longer for my paper on the dispersal of remains. In addition to that, I just attended a training session for dog handlers, which included RCMP members, Parks Canada, and other invitees in Red Deer. It was really lovely to be included in the event and meet some new faces. Recognition about the importance of patterns in the dispersal of remains is something I've been trying to get for many, many years. But it seems that we're finally starting to talk about it and realize the importance of doing the research and talking about it and having conversations and seeing that there are patterns in the dispersal of remains. It was great to know that people are open to learning about dispersed remains and about the scavenging study, and I hope we can continue the conversation and continue to learn from each other. The 50th in-person annual meeting of the Canadian Association for Biological Anthropologists is fast approaching. It is happening at the end of October in Winnipeg. Winnipeg. Good old Winnipeg. I hope to be there. It would be really nice. There's a symposium proposed for forensic taphonomy, and I hope to be there to learn what's been going on in the Canadian research world regarding forensic taphonomy, but I have also submitted a paper. So we'll see if it gets accepted, and we'll see if I present. I hope to see you there. In addition to all of this, I would really like to know about you, dear listener. I have made a very short survey, maybe about 5 questions, and it's because my website doesn't collect information on my listeners. So I know nothing about you. I know that people are listening, but I don't know who you are. So I would love if you were to tell me where you're listening from. What country are you in? Are you what do you find useful and or entertaining about the podcast? What keeps you coming back, and what would you like to hear more of? So, like I said, the survey's like really short, 5 questions. It's just a Google form. You go in, you fill it out, and you press submit. That's it. And I get to learn about you. To sweeten the pot, if you complete the survey with your email address, I'll enter you into a draw to win the ebook version of my novel, Memoirs of a Reluctant Archaeologist. The draw will be done on December 1st, 2023, so make sure you fill it out before then and include your email address if you'd like to be entered into the draw. And I would really love to learn more about you. So even if you don't want the book, please fill it out so I can get to know more about you. If you find this podcast and the information in it useful, please do consider supporting it by donating. You can donate through Buy Me a Coffee. This is a platform through which you can donate the cost of a coffee, whether it's $5, $10, one coffee, two coffee, what have you. And the money goes directly to me to support my time. My time on this podcast is significant. I spend a lot of time reading journal articles and books to find interviewees and to stay current in the fields of bioarchaeology, forensic anthropology, and many, many other disciplines. I also do the post-production of the podcast, including editing the transcripts and editing the sound. So if you enjoy this podcast, please consider buying me a coffee. The link is in the show notes, and it is also on my website, yvonnechorlin.com. If you want to ask me a question, you can. Do you know what? I would love to hear from you. You can reach me through my website, yvonnechorlin.com. That's YVONNEKJORLIEN.com. You can email me at yvonnechorlin@gmail.com or contact me through my Facebook page, Reluctant Archaeologist, or through Instagram at Yvonne Chorlin. You can also comment on the podcast through my website and YouTube, and you can reach out and tell me what you think of the show and what you're learning about dead people. Now here is the interview.
Yes, well, I just want to thank you, Yvonne, for having me on today. I am Brie Smith. I go by Brie, and I am the Chief Operating Officer at Return Home. We specialize in an end-of-life option that is an alternative to burial and cremation. We call it terramation, and it is the gentle breakdown of the body into compost to return to families in place of ashes or in place of a burial.
Okay, I'm just going to bottom line this and say that it's human composting.
Human composting,
All
body
right.
composting.
Oh, yeah, I understand that. Yeah, this is a sensitive topic.
Yes.
Anything involving death is. But on the other hand, sometimes you just got to come right out and just say it.
Yes, I have a lot of people in my life who have become very accustomed to me very casually talking about their inevitable demise. So
It's funny how it suddenly becomes a topic of conversation more often than not, right?
it does with me, at least. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So tell us a bit about Return Home and how you came to be at Return Home and its inception and all of that great stuff.
Sure. Well, I can kind of start at the beginning. So, Washington State passed unprecedented legislation in January of 2019. And that was for funeral directors to begin offering what's called natural organic reduction in the law. But the layman would call it human composting. And what happened is there was a general kind of panic amongst the industry in the area because there was really no prescribed method in which to accomplish what they were giving us laws to do. So they gave us the rules and regulations, but they didn't give us any processes or machinery or anything that would end up making up what we at Return Home have built. So our CEO, his name is Micah Truman. He was sitting with his mom one day. She lives on Lopez Island, and she had some friends from New York in town, and they were sitting in a circle. And Micah said, "Did you hear about this crazy thing? They're going to be composting bodies." And they're all, these women are in maybe their late 70s, and they all were like, "We love it. We think it's fabulous. Ship me to Washington because I'm in New York." And in that moment, he had this clear vision of the fact that this is actually something that people really resonate with, is, the natural breakdown of the body as opposed to something kind of expedited or being preserved indefinitely. A lot of people really are innately drawn to kind of a natural breakdown. And so that was kind of the inception point of I can do something with this. So what Micah did is he went to a group of individuals. They are called mortality composters. Mortality composters are individuals who help with ranchers and farmers when they have a mass devastation of, a group of animals. So if it's a flock of chickens or if it's a herd of cows or some pigs, what happens is these mortality composters will go to the place where the devastation happened, and they will set up a temporary composting facility where they will take those animals, make them into compost that the farmer or rancher can then use to enrich their property. And so that is what's happening. And it's an old science. It's a dialed science, and it's actually done throughout the whole United States, and in Canada. But these people had a very specific way to compost these animals, and it was very what some might consider irreverent to a human being's body. So they might stack the animals up and coat them in something nitrogen rich, like chicken feces, and then they would break down super fast in a big pile because they're all real hot. And it's these things were where the minds of the mortality composters were. And then Micah came in with a mind of, we need to make this acceptable for human care and for the love that we want to show people when they pass away, and to be able to present this to a family. So ultimately, it took about 2.5 years of Micah working with the mortality composters. I joined in about 2 years in, and also helped with kind of the idea that we wanted to make the service hands-on for families. But really the entire development of our vessel system and the organics that go inside, our off-gassing and our biofilters, all of that was done with Micah and a group of what we call the Ocean's 11 team of, again, mortality composters and PhDs in composting. These are HVAC people who helped us build the facility, general contractors, and then, of course, funeral professionals. So we all came together, again, 2.5 years after inception. So we opened to serve families in June of 2021. And we have been in operation for just over 2 years, and we've served over 200 families. And I joined with Return Home after being a traditional funeral home employee. I had been in the industry since 2011, and I am still a licensed funeral director, embalmer, and crematory operator. And I was really drawn to Return Home because of the final product, really, what we're giving families back in place of ashes. I had worked the crematory primarily. It's about 90% cremation in the county that I live in and worked in. And I didn't take to cremating. It was not something I enjoyed doing. It was a very quick and kind of aggressive process that, I never quite felt great doing. And so when this opportunity came with Return Home, and Micah knew that I was kind of into green options, it was a really natural fit together. And it's been my pleasure to grow from the services manager of the company now to, again, COO, and overseeing all of the operations, both in the family services and the composting itself.
Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for that. There's a couple things that I would love to address in all of that. First is a little bit about your journey and how you became a funeral director, like how you found out that you wanted to pursue that path to become a funeral director, embalmer, cremation specialist, and then once we cover that, a little bit about what traditional funeral homes offer, and that it isn't mandatory. You don't have to go through, you don't have to be embalmed or cremated. That they're all of this narrative around funeral homes can be quite misleading. So
Yeah.
first, let's get into your journey because not everybody starts life wanting to be a funeral director.
Yeah, yeah, well, neither did I. I mean, it's good to point out that this was not what I thought I would be doing with my life. I thought I would maybe go into sports medicine or, surgical. I really always loved anatomy and physiology.
Mm.
I blame a couple things. Blame is a funny word for it, but I give credit to the fact that my mother was a cosmetologist when I was young, and she did hair and makeup for a mortuary. And so at night, my dad was a beat cop, so he would be working the nights as a police officer. And so my mom would take me to the morgue with her, and I would sit with her while she did people's hair and makeup. And she tells this story that one day we were there together and a broom fell, and she had like this moment of panic. And I very calmly looked over at her and I said, "Mom, it's not like she's going to hurt you." So I just had a really solid comprehension of life and death at a very young age. I'm talking like 6 to 9 years old is when I was going with her. I was also raised on a ranch, so I really understood the circle of life in a way that not every kid is exposed to, I think. And then I took a anatomy and physiology class where I had to restore a likeness of a person from a skull. And we used erasers and we used clay, and we built this person's face up based on their sex and their nationality or their race. And so what we did is we built these faces up, and I found in that class that I had a real knack for what we call in the industry restorative art. And that is, it's a level kind of beyond embalming, where traditional embalming, you have a person who looks really beautiful and you make them look more beautiful with your efforts and the injection. In this case, these are for devastated individuals who have completely maybe lost half of their face, or their hands have been, mutilated, or it is a skill of mine to go in and restore them back to their likeness. And so I really fell in love with that. And after that, it was a kind of a no-brainer for me that I was meant to do this for people. Um, the cruel irony being that I moved to the Pacific Northwest, where barely anyone is embalmed ever. And I rarely got to practice my craft. And I ended up, essentially burning people all day instead of bringing them back to beautiful so their family could say goodbye. And so it was, something that I was really passionate about, but that I didn't have the opportunity to practice as regularly as I would like to. So that's what steered me toward return home. And here we actually get to do quite a bit of restorative art. We just don't use chemicals. And we've done chemicalless visitations for about 70% of our families come in and see their loved one before they say goodbye. So, so it's been really awesome to be able to stretch my skill set in a place where I can't use the tools I'm used to using. So both myself and Katie, who's our funeral director here, are licensed embalmers, and we still do long bone donation cases, and we still do autopsy cases, and we help these families say a final goodbye without the use of chemical. So that's been really awesome. So that's kind of been the development of my career so far.
Wow, cool. So you had a very early exposure to not just the funeral home, but also to death.
Definitely.
Wow. Yeah. Because a lot of people, especially those people living in cities, do not have that exposure.
Yeah, yeah. The cyclical, farm life. I went in the summers, so I would go for branding season, and all of
Mm.
these little snippets of life where I would see the crop come and go, and I would see the animals come and go, and it was just kind of part of the atmosphere that I was around, that nothing kind of lasted forever. And I think it gave me the ability to accept death in a different kind of way than what we might call a city slicker, you know?
Right, right. So let's talk a bit about your experiences working within the traditional funeral home environment, and what you learned, and what you found that didn't resonate with you, and had you kind of, longing for something else.
You know what I think? When you ask me that question, it's multifaceted because I worked for an excellent company, a family owned, but they owned many facilities. And I think one of the hurdles that I was having to go through on a regular basis was the fact that I wasn't able to make personal or kind of customize our services. It was kind of a prescribed, this is the menu you get to choose from. And then the family would choose from the menu, and then we would fulfill what they chose. Um, it, it was a little bit much also to me to not get to give input. It was very hard to feel like I could better the systems or better the service in some way, and then not feel like I was maybe being considered because it wasn't the traditional way of doing things, or it wasn't the way we were supposed to do things, or, so I think that there is kind of ingrained in the industry in some ways a real prescribed idea of what families should choose and what's the best thing for them, when in actuality, what I've learned since joining Return Home is that it's innate to people to be part of the planning of their loved one's death, and not in the service, but actually in the handling of the remains, and of the reverence for the quiet moments together instead of these big, public moments that might have happened, and both might happen still. But at Return Home, my point of really bringing families back into the equation, where the hands that love you in life can continue loving you in death, is based on the fact that I couldn't do that freely previously. And it was something that I feel like the funeral industry has kind of come in and removed families' abilities to see their loved ones decompose in any way. Like if I've had a family see their loved one with a green belly, and if I would have done that in my previous work, it would have been curtains. I mean, it's a really bad look to have somebody breaking down in front of the family, but
Right.
it's natural, and people see it, and they know that that person has passed away, and there's a grief and a connection with the grieving process that goes along with seeing your person deceased, and not seeing them in the hospital and then never seeing them again, or whatever that might look like to some people. So I see it benefit the family in a major way in their grief, to be able to open the doors of the funeral home and say, how much do you want to be involved? And that's what was missing previously, that I'm really proud to be able to integrate here in what people might consider like progressive or non-traditional services.
Very cool. Well, just a personal story. So my father passed away in 2018, and he just didn't answer his phone. And so my sister went over and checked, and sure enough, he had passed away at home. And so it took me a while to get up there and to assist and whatever. And by the time I got there, the funeral home had already arrived, and so I didn't get to see him. And so my perception was he was alive one minute and then just vanished the next. And the next time when I went to the funeral home, I actually asked to see him. And they said, sorry, we can't let you back for health and safety reasons. And I thought,
Oh,
that's kind of weird. So I have this sort of left open. I had, in without, belittling the word or anything, but I have no closure because I wasn't actually able to see him dead.
yeah.
So my mind has this weird thing around, did he actually die? He could be like Elvis and, frequenting 7-Elevens or, weird places. It's
Oh,
this weird concept that because I wasn't allowed to see his body, I, in some capacity, don't really know he's dead.
yeah. That is a disconnect that I have heard so many times. And your story really it really touches my heart because this is the conversations that I've had with several people since they've chosen our service. They're like, I didn't get to see XYZ, and being able to be here and do this time has completely changed my perception of what it means when somebody passes away and my involvement in that. And
Mm.
and that is it's one of to me, it's one of the things that inhibits people's ability to get closure. Like you said, I don't really believe in closure, to be frank.
Yeah.
I know that grief ebbs and flows, and I know that it never ends because I've experienced it, and I'm still
Hmm.
grieving things that happened, well over a decade ago, and it's just how it goes. But being able to be the arbiter of somebody passing away and then looking at that family and saying, do you need time with them, instead of me just coming and dispatching right away and asking the question, not just being like, okay, the call came in, we're going to go 90-minute call time, we did great. It's great for the business to be quick and to move like that, but what is great for the family? And that's the question that we ask ourselves at Return Home, and we end up asking our families. And that's why people have had such transformative experiences here, because we give it back to them and we say, let's talk about what you feel like you need, and then we'll kind of go from there. And usually when you ask someone, do you want to see or put your hands on your loved one before they go into their terramation vessel and stuff, it's so common for them to be like, oh, I don't think so, and then the next day call and be like, actually,
Yeah.
you know what, I do need that, and then we make that happen for them, and it helps them.
Because it's like you go into a shock and you just really aren't, I don't feel capable of making decisions, like even small decisions, like do you want to touch your loved one before they go into the vessel? Like
Mhm.
that's a small decision, but under those conditions it can be monumental. That's a huge decision to make, and you're grieving, you're in shock.
Mhm.
And yeah, I agree that yeah, that the loved ones are kind of disconnected from the process in the traditional funeral home environment.
Well, and the number of times I sat across from someone with my menu and they chose their menu options, and then I wrote it all out and then they signed it. And then the next day they had no recollection of what we put together. None.
Yeah.
So we encourage people to take their time with the arrangements, because we are kind of what we would consider eco-friendly, or green, or mindful of the environment. We don't use a lot of paper. So we just send people a link and they can take their time with, inputting the loved one's information. They can get help from family members in that database, and bring people in to help them. So we're not just sitting across from a family, having them choose all of these, and the choice of whether to touch your loved one or not. How about the choice of a $2,000 casket that maybe isn't, amazingly beautiful, but it's within your budget, or the $7,000 one that's absolutely gorgeous, but in both cases you'll never see it again.
Right.
So what's the
Right.
right choice? I mean, it's so debatable what the value of the funeral home and the funeral director is, but I found that at Return Home, the value of the funeral director is being able to get that family to take their time, breathe in and out of the grief that they're feeling, and move at a pace that works for them, where they can decide to be participatory or not.
Wonderful. So I don't want to get too much into the history of funerals and funeral homes, but just suffice to say that embalming is a very recent practice.
Yes, yeah. The Civil War is when embalming really became the most prevalent outside of like ancient Egypt, basically. But in the U.S., the Civil War is what did it, because the men were passing away and then needed to make their way home, afterward, for services, for funeral services and things like that. It became a common practice, and yeah, there are pictures. It's pretty. Common knowledge within the industry that in some mortuary books that exist out there, there's actually pictures of bodies that are kind of propped up as, this is the work that I can do, like along the battlefield, because the embalmer really became really, really needed at that time.
Right.
They didn't have refrigeration, and that's something that people don't quite understand, is that nowadays in the modern world we have refrigeration, and in certain circumstances completely negates the need for embalming. There's a time and a place for embalming, though. That is for certain. And it is an art that, we do have respect for. But at the end of the day, it's a lot less needed now than it would have been 150 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and so much of this make the funeral business makes it seem mandatory that embalming is mandatory, that you have to go through a funeral home. It's mandatory, and you don't know to question all this, because usually when you're in this environment of being in a funeral home faced with death, you are also within a grieving situation.
Mhm.
You're in shock. You don't have the ability to make decisions, maybe even to think critically at
Mhm.
that time. So, questioning any of the practices, questioning the processes, questioning anything that is said to you just isn't within your realm. So that's why I wanted to bring this up now, so that people can question it now.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the proudest things that I think I'm most proud of that we've accomplished at Return Home is really putting out on our social media the knowledge that we have transported people from Canada unembalmed. We cannot do it with any other country because pretty much every other country in the entire world requires embalming to cross the border, but Canada does not. And so we've been able to accommodate those families. We've been able to accommodate families from over 20 different states. And the only state that requires embalming to cross state lines is Alabama. And other than that, you do not need to be embalmed at all. And in Alabama, you don't have to if you're not going to cross state lines. So it is really interesting because I didn't realize how prevalent it was that the funeral homes kind of might push embalming or imply that it's required to have a visitation or to say goodbyes. It's simply not true. It can restore when someone has been really sick and make them look healthier. It can do a lot of really amazing things for people in need. But most people who die naturally really never ever have to be embalmed. And I think that that's something that we're proud to be able to share that information widely because it's such a misconception.
Nice. I like that. All right, let's talk about human composting. Get into some of the science here, because
Yeah.
when we talked previously, when I first heard about return home and human composting, one of my first questions was, okay, you can do it with the soft tissue, but what happens with the bones?
Yes.
Because I know, as a former archaeologist, that I dig up bones all the time,
Yes.
and there's no soft tissue. But in, let's say, peat bogs, there can be no bones, but soft tissue, skin left. So,
Right.
but it all depends on the environment.
Yes.
So, how do you deal with that soft tissue versus hard tissue?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's dialed. I will say that I'm so proud of our science here because it was kind of a deal breaker for me when I started. I was like, I have to do this before I join because I have to know that this actually works. And trusting our team too. John Paul is our PhD soil scientist. So he created everything that we do. And I trust him so much. And he is such an amazing person. It's just such a pleasure to be able to work alongside of him, truly. He created a system where we place the person in a vessel. They're 8 foot by 3.5 by 3.5. So they're just big rectangular vessels. There is nothing inside of the vessel except for tubes that allow oxygen to flow through. And what we do is we place straw alfalfa and sawdust inside of the vessel, about halfway up, roughly, give or take, but it's at a certain ratio of the organics to the person's body weight. So what we do is we place, those three organic materials inside of the vessel. We then lay the person in. And before this happens, we've gone through the steps of receiving them into our care. We give every single person who comes into our care a bath because we believe it is just basic human decency to be clean. So if they are not clean, we clean them and we place them in a compostable garment. And then they go into the vessel just right on top of, we kind of make a cradle with a pillow and a little indention. They settle in there and then the remaining organics go on top. And so the person is kind of sandwiched or cozied in between the two layers of organics. And what happens over the next 30 to 60 days is we place them on a system where we have 24/7 monitoring over the oxygen, the temperature, and then oh my gosh, I just totally blanked out. I'm so sorry. Starting from the top. We constantly monitor the airflow, the temperature, and the moisture levels inside of that vessel. And so we have a probe that's in there that's making sure that the temperature is the state minimum for composting human remains is 132 degrees for no less than 72 hours, and that is to kill pathogens. And so for us, that number we far exceed it. Usually, the people in our care are reaching about 150 to 160 degrees for maybe 2 weeks. So we have really optimized the internal environment in that vessel for the body to break down quickly. Um, what happens is we make sure that the moisture is at the right level. We make sure that the temperature is rising the way it should be. And then when that temperature begins to drop, what we do is we have an external rotator. So our vessels go into this machine that reminds me of those old like virtual reality rides that they used to have in malls. I know that's really silly and specific, but it's like a big, ride that you place the vessel into, and the person kind of rotates slowly over about 2 minutes. And what it does is it equalizes the moisture within the vessel. And so we'll see another spike in temperature because organics that have not used up the nitrogen or the energy that they have inside of them are being exposed to the what you call the soft tissue, and that means that there's another spike in the temperature and another breakdown. So what we do is we kind of go back and forth to the rotator over the next couple of weeks, and we, again, everybody is different, so we gauge it based on the temperature and the readings that we're getting from our cloud. But ultimately, when we see the fall in temperature and then there's no spike after we go to rotation, that's when we know that the soft tissue is completely gone. There is no more energy inside of that vessel to use up, and there are only bones remaining at that time. What happens after that is we go to what we call screening. Screening is very similar to after a cremation, where you would sweep out the contents of the retort, that is bones and anything inorganic, and then you go through those with a magnet to make sure that nothing's inside of there that will go into the processor, which is what in the crematory breaks down the bone to make it fluffy or completely uniform, ideally. So what we've done is we took that science and we duplicated it. It's just a lot bigger. We upend the vessel. We have a team who goes in and we pull anything inorganic. So we're pulling, any metal replacements, hip stent screws. We are also looking for things that are inorganic that may have been inside of the body, like silicone. And we are pulling those, and they either get recycled or go to medical waste. And then what happens is the bones and the compost stay together and all go through a piece of machinery that's called a processor. And essentially it makes the bone uniform with the compost. So it's breaking the bone down and making it unidentifiable amongst the compost that's already there. And then what happens is the bones are, as you know, I'm sure very well, porous on the inside. So when we expose that porous material to these microbes, we see the temperature spike again because there's microbial activity again. So after the bones and the compost are broken down together, we go to what's called the resting phase, because what's going to happen is we're going to get a spike in temperature, but then this temperature is going to slowly lower. The moisture content is going to lessen, and they're going to off gas a little bit of CO2 as they rest. And what happens is they lower in temperature and moisture to the point where at the end they're ambient, there's no more microbial activity, and then they're ready to go home. So the first phase takes about 30 to 60 days depending on the person's body makeup. And then the second phase takes pretty much an exact 30 days, because once that temperature drops and goes ambient, we're ready to go home with the person. So that's really the science behind what we do. Granted, there's the mixture of organics and those ratios, and the moisture ratios are very important. But we have really worked hard to make sure that each person is we know if they're emaciated going in, what we need to compensate for. We know if they're obese going in, what we need to compensate for. And so we've really dialed the science to be able to serve our families in what I consider to be the most transparent and in my opinion, the most gentle way that any facility provides this service.
I find that very interesting because I knew that cremation, um, the fire will only take care of so much, and that the bones, usually whatever remains, then has to be ground down. So it's uniform size and there's nothing identifiable.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, with the human composting, like I said, that takes care of a lot of the soft tissue, but then you're left with the hard tissue, the bone,
Mhm.
and breaking down that bone so then it becomes available to the microbes, so then it can further break down the organic components of the bone tissue. That's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and it works. I mean, just the small spongy bones might even break down. Can I say I've ever seen like a metatarsal in the compost? Like not identifiably,
Right.
but I like an I actually likened it. It's so funny that that's what you did because when I first started with Micah and we did our first screening, because I was the one back there doing it, our team was very small at that time. Um, I pulled a femur out of the compost and it felt like archaeology. It felt like, oh my God, this is so beautiful and clean of tissue. And I mean, just the fact that it's actually happening still to this day, 2.5 years later, just kind of blows my mind. It really is so miraculous what happens. And it can't be overstated how obvious it is that the body is meant to break down. It just
Hmm.
it brings you full circle on this whole thing of like, wow, it really, we are meant to, just like the leaves fall in the fall. If we left them there instead of raking them up, they would nurture the earth for the springtime. And that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to nurture the earth for the next generations to come. And because we don't die all and go directly into the earth the way we used to, and we don't, use the bathroom and put it back into the earth the way we used to, we're really depriving the planet of a lot of organic material. And so I'm really proud that the company that I'm standing behind returns organic matter to the earth. I think it is vital to the health of our planet. And John Paul, who's our PhD, says that about 50% of the soil health of the planet has depleted. And that if we don't start giving back to it, it will never be able to be recovered.
Wow. That's a whole other level. That's
It's
a whole other
really,
podcast episode.
John Paul is amazing. So if you ever wanted to go down that rabbit hole, you just let me know because he is fascinating.
All right. So, on that note, let's talk about the difference between terramation, water cremation, and green burial. You've got this whole lovely, for the listeners, Return Home has a whole lovely website, and under their resources, they have a lot of educational articles.
Yeah.
And if you want to delve deep, go there. But I thought the difference between terramation, water cremation, and green burial would be something nice to mention here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's accessibility based a lot of the time, and the difference is as far as what you're choosing to do is with all three lower your footprint. I mean, the bottom line is that they are all three much less wasteful than a traditional cremation or burial with embalming might be. Um, I really, really loved green burial. I still do. I mean, but before I even started with Return Home, green burial was my choice for myself. I like the idea of just, a natural shroud made of either wicker or bamboo or maybe just be placed in something that's soft to the touch, cotton or linen, but to just be placed directly into the earth and break down is something that I find super beautiful. But a lot of people are turned off by bugs. I had no idea how many people would ask us about the bugs. We don't
Yep.
have bugs, we have microbes. Bugs couldn't survive the temperatures inside of the vessel. But for green burial specifically, I find that people like green burial until they talk about the bugs, and then they're like, yeah, that's kind of not for me. I really don't want to be, consumed by worms. It's weird. And so So to me, I think it's lovely. I understand where people might get a little strange about it. It's also using land in perpetuity. I think that's something that's really special about terramation is that there's no requirement for zoning of any kind, and it's just like scattering cremated remains. Whereas with burial, even if it is a green burial, you have to go in at least Washington to a zoned cemetery, and that cemetery has to offer a direct to earth burial. Some of them will say that they do, but they're still inverting an outer burial container over you so that they can drive over you with heavy equipment and things like that. So yeah, green burials are very interesting, and there's a lot of nuance. You also, when you do a green burial, you're putting the heavy metals that are in the person's body in the earth. So,
Mm.
that's something that didn't used to be the case. We used to not put metal bits in people, and we do that now. So there's a conversation to be had around that. Um, it, it, for me, green burial is my second choice to terramation. I still think it's absolutely beautiful and I love it. Alkaline hydrolysis, that is what some people call water cremation or aquamation. A very gentle breakdown. It does use some resources. It uses a lot of water because what's happening is that you're being placed in a container that is agitating and working with chemical to break your body down, but in a more natural or rather gentle way than a cremation might do so. The process takes a little bit longer than a cremation, but at the end, you're left with more remains and they are stark white. So instead of ashes that come to you and they're kind of gray and black and splotchy, and alkaline remains are absolutely pure white and beautiful, and you get more because it's less aggressive. So the crematory is not breaking the bone down within the vessel that you're in, the pod that you're in for the alkaline hydrolysis breaks you down slowly. And so there's more bone material because it's not kind of blasting you away, if you will. I really like alkaline hydrolysis. I think it's a beautiful service, especially for animals. A lot of people come to Return Home asking if we compost animals, and the answer is no, not we could, but it would be really costly to set up that facility, and so we're just not in a position to do that right now. But a lot of places all over the U.S. and my understanding is in Canada offer it for pets, alkaline hydrolysis, and it to me is a beautiful alternative to just standard cremation. And then of course, you're getting an urn back, very similarly to cremation. With terramation, it's pretty cool because the body is placed in the vessel with organic material that makes it so that we can return about 200 to 250 pounds of organic matter to the earth. We give the family the option to take the full amount with them. If they do, it is placed in burlap because we're continuing the cycle of life and the compost needs to breathe. So we put it in something that has airflow. And families go and do, memorial gardens. They've gone to arboretums. They've gone to cemeteries. So the options for the terramated remains are pretty much what they are for cremated remains, except instead of an inert charred carbon, you're giving back something that has magnesium and phosphates and carbon and all the things that the earth actually wants and needs to thrive. But it's got the same mobility as cremated remains, which I think is the draw for a lot of people. I think less people choose burial a lot because we're nuclear. We're moving now. We're not growing up in Eastern Montana and spending our whole life there and marrying someone from there and having kids and dying there. We're moving, we're going from A to B. And so the mobility of the remains is something that we find a lot of families prefer to taking up land indefinitely. So that's kind of like the quick breakdown of the comparison of the three. I feel like I covered them pretty well.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I like that you brought up the cycle of life and contributing to the life of the earth, because with embalming in the traditional sense, you're actually polluting the earth because all that
Yes.
formaldehyde that then sits in the earth, those and it's probably contaminating the groundwater. Then you've got the coffin and what it's made of, the lacquers that are used on that
Mhm.
coffin, the materials, the textiles, and whatever they're treated with.
Mhm.
And all of that is sitting in the ground. So it's actually depleting the earth
Right.
of its value, whereas terramation is giving value to the soil.
Yeah, and I mean, it is directly contributing to families' gardens just absolutely being gorgeous. I mean, it is you can really it's I would say it's not like when you go to the store and you buy compost, because even then they can be chemical laden.
Yes.
What's so amazing about what we're doing is it's just it, everything that your body could give to the earth that is good, and then we can remove anything that might not be, and we negate the pathogens, and we negate the chemotherapy and the radiation, and you know what I mean. So these
Hmm.
things that may be a consideration are a non-issue, and they're actually processed through the terramation, where really the only people we can't help as far as diseases or what's in their body is if you have a prion related illness. So Creutzfeldt-Jakob or mad cow disease would
Mm.
be a no-go, because the temperature inside the vessel won't kill the prions. Only cremation can do that. Um, so we have that limitation, but other than that, I mean, we can really take someone who, was unwell, and their family saw them, break down over time, and they became just a piece of who they once were. And when we return them back to the family, that family gets to see that person's life live on and really see it happening. It's pretty cool.
Nice. All right. I'm conscious of the time. So you said return home is you're in Washington State, but you can accept decedents from Canada. Um, I looked on your website and I didn't see any update about return home actually coming to Canada and setting up a facility. Is there any news on that?
Yeah, so for us, it's just about legislation, right? So um, it depends on the area that is looking. In the US, we've had 7 states now that have legalized the process, and it is a state issue. So state by state, they make up their disposition laws and rules and regulations, and they oversee them. So in Canada, is it province by province that they decide on those things, or is it national? I don't actually know the answer to that question. Um,
I don't know either. I'd have to look it up.
what I know is that there has been no legislation passed thus far in Canada, but that it is a big topic of conversation for a lot of people there. Especially, it was amazing to me because I really thought our first case would be from BC. We're in Seattle, basically proper
Right.
almost, and so our first family from Canada was from Toronto.
Oh,
And
really?
they flew with her to the facility to see her off at a service, and then they flew back to bring her home. So that family came to and fro on that plane, and to me, absolutely I would love to have them not have to do that. Like, our end goal would be to be local to people where they wouldn't have to make grand journeys to fulfill this process. But I'll say the people who know about it and decide on it are all in, and they love it, and they're so glad that their loved one can can have the ability to be here with us. We do a lot of digital and virtual services and things like that, because we do serve so many people from out of state. um, but it's so amazing to me to see that the states are legalizing, Canada's discussing it, and certainly when those policies go through, we will be setting our sights on being accessible. I think that's super important to the cause of what we do.
Fabulous. All right. Well, you do have a very informative website, returnhome.com. And do you have a blog or some way to keep up to date on what is new?
Yeah, so we, of course, as you mentioned, have a really comprehensive blog and resource center. We do both, and they're for different things. So the Return Home blog is specifically more geared toward body composting and terramation and what we do. And then the resource center is actually just industry general, like you said, it compares and contrasts things. So we have those resources. My favorite thing that we do is actually something our CEO, Micah, does. Once a month, he sends out a newsletter, and it's just one email that kind of encompasses what we've done that month. But they're very entertaining, and it's very interesting to read up on the advancements of whatever's happening in the space at that time. So when you go to our website, I definitely suggest signing up for the newsletter. You can also chat with our staff there. So if you jump on the website, down at the bottom, it'll pop up and it'll say, do you want to talk to us? And you're not talking to somebody elsewhere. You are literally talking to me, Katie, Jake. We take the chats, we take every single phone call. We don't have a call service because we believe in being accessible, and people have all the questions and we want to answer all the questions. We also do a lot of social media outreach. So we're Return Home NOR at Return Home NOR on a lot of the platforms. So whether it be TikTok or Instagram, we're always posting educational content because there's a lot of developments that happen in the space, and we just want people to be informed on what happens to them. We want them to think about the fact that there's options out there that may be atypical, and that they should. I feel like people should get to know their local mortician or funeral director the same way that they would get to know, maybe a doctor or somebody who's in their life, because we're so resourceful. I think that being able to be a resource for people at Return Homes, it's such an honor and pleasure that people would come to us, because they come to us again with questions about composting or just death care in general, death, dying. We're experts in beforehand, aftercare, and everything in between. And we know a lot about a lot because we've seen a lot. And everybody here who's works with our staff has been in the funeral industry, for most of us, for at least 8 years or so. And then Micah is the only one who's kind of a newbie, which is really funny because he's leading the whole thing. But that's where you can find us. And we really try to be available for those Q&As pretty much anytime, because we know there's a lot to ask.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about. And unfortunately, it's in hindsight. Well, for my dad's death, but foresight, I think, for, my own planning and what have you, because like I mentioned, you're just not in a space when it does happen. And so being informed prior to is a good thing. And you've given me a lot to think about. So thank you for that.
Oh gosh, it's my pleasure to just kind of share the good word of it's okay to think about it. It's not, it's not like you would talk about death and you're gonna die. That's not how life works. It can be a topic of conversation that you bring up and you think about, and then it won't happen for another 60 years, So it's something to consider, to think about, does it matter to you what happens to you? And if you've lived your whole life being a steward of the planet, and you're mindful of your waste, and, you're that person, it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense for you to just be cremated at the end. There's things that you can do that you would feel good about and your family would feel good about, that might just be a better option for you. So it's something to think about.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Brie, and good luck with Return Home.
Thank you for having me. And again, if you want John Paul on, you just let me know.
All right.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.